Hi everybody, Mr. Wada here, and today we're going to be going over the nitrogen cycle. And in doing so, we are going to answer the question, why is it hard for plants to breathe nitrogen? So to start, why is nitrogen so important? Well, you have amino acids and proteins that have a backbone made of nitrogen, and it's also the backbone for DNA and RNA. To start, here's 20 common amino acids. If you ever had any pre-workout or taken any sort of supplement for the gym, like protein powder, etc., they're usually loaded with amino acids because amino acids are what you use to make proteins, and proteins are what make muscle and other stuff like it. So these right here are the building blocks for that. And in order to get that, you'll notice each of them has nitrogen, 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 nitrogen. It's everywhere. You need them for all these. You can't make any of those without nitrogen. Nitrogen's extremely important. It's also the backbone for DNA. Take a look over here on the right. You've got the abbreviations here for hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus in ball form. And they are showing you the shape of the double helix for DNA, which, by the way, is an offset helix. It's not a perfect straight up helix. And notice nitrogen is in blue. Each of these has a bunch of circles here that represent nitrogen, and they're called nitrogenous bases, the individual pieces, TACG. Those are nitrogenous base pairs, and you put them together, and that's how you make DNA. So, moral of the story is you can't make any of this stuff, or anything really that's living, without nitrogen. And this shouldn't be a problem because nitrogen makes up over 70% of the air that you breathe. So the majority of the atmosphere is nitrogen. There's more of it than there is oxygen, and we breathe oxygen out of it just fine. So why is it hard for plants and other living things to get nitrogen? Well, take a look at those two. And if you want to pause the video really quick and think about what's different between those two pictures. Okay, the reason is because triple bonds are strong. So if you imagine that each of the lines between those is a bond, that's what they are. If you imagine that those are like ropes though, and they're really tight, you would have to cut through one extra one, which means you have a lot more work to do if you're trying to break through that. Imagine each of those is like a steel cable. Having 3 of them is much more than having 2 in that case. And triple bonds are really rare in nature because it takes energy to put those together. So the moral of the story is if it takes a bunch of energy to put it together like that, it's going to take a lot of energy to break it apart. And we can't do that. We're not very good at that. And plants can't do it either. And we get our nitrogen ultimately from plants. So, well, if plants can't do it, we can't do it. What can? What can do it are things like algae. And these have an enzyme called nitrogenase, and that can break the triple bond. And that's really rare. There are not many things that can do that. And it makes sense if you think about the order of the food chain now, because the order of the food chain makes sense based on the ability to attain nutrients. At the very base of it, you have things like bacteria getting consumed by things that are slightly larger, or blue-green algae that are slightly larger. And they get eaten by things that are larger. They take the nitrogen from them and the carbon from them, etc., and it feeds up the chain. So here's the abridged version of this. This is on land, by the way, so this is slightly different in the water, which we're going to get to. We're almost there, by the way. We're pretty close to done. So the way it normally works is you have nitrogen in the air because there's so much of it, but plants themselves can't take this in very well. So what happens is there's bacteria or something like them, like algae or something like it, and they can fix the nitrogen. They're called nitrogen fixing because they take the nitrogen out of the air and they affix it or attach it to other stuff, and in doing so, make it something that can be absorbed. Some of them are called ammonificating because they take the nitrogen and they make ammonia or ammonium out of it. Ammonia would be NH3, ammonium is NH4+. And the point is, those bacteria they take nitrogen and they attach hydrogen or oxygen to it, and then it can be absorbed. So you see the plant at the top there. Legumes, things like beans, peanuts, etc. They have bacteria that grow on their roots that can do this. Other plants don't necessarily have that ability, so they depend on bacteria to break it down for them. Decomposers can take living things once they've died and break them down too. And when they do that, they will take nitrogen and separate it out into ammonium. And then that can be nitrified, which means making it more like a nitrite or a nitrate. And as they do that, you get nitrites and nitrates. And those are extremely useful forms of nitrogen. They can be broken up really easily by the bodies of living things, like plants and animals. So they can manage that much better. We can't make that on our own, though, and we're above the ground, so we're not going to be like digging through the dirt, eating it to get that. So we're going to get our nitrogen from plants normally, and plants will get that from the soil after bacteria have broken it down into nitrites, nitrates, and ammonium. Usually nitrates are the ones that they need. And then last fun fact here, you can do this reverse process where you take nitrates that are fixed and you denitrify them back into N2. Those are called denitrifying bacteria. And the final thing that I think is really cool is that lightning is one of the only natural processes that has enough energy to break that down. If you have lightning strike, you can break apart the nitrogen as two atoms bonded together into individual ones. And when that happens, it'll attach with oxygen and stuff in the air to make nitrates. All right, so that's on the ground. How about in the water? Process looks super complicated on paper here, but it's really the exact same thing. There are a couple of differences, like you'll get nitrous oxide because of the extra step for the denitrification at the bottom there. But moral of the story is still the same. You're going to get nitrogen from the air. That's naturally where we're going to always get it. There are some sort of bacteria that can fix it. So they're called, in this case, nitrogen-fixing microorganisms, but that could be bacteria or other things like archaea. They're not technically bacteria the same way. And they turn it into ammonia or break it into ammonium. And then other things can take that ammonium and turn it into nitrite or nitrate. Those go into the bottom of the food chain. So like phytoplankton, zooplankton, and really small fish will eat up the zooplankton and the phytoplankton. So now they have nitrate. And then bigger things eat them. We release ammonia and pee and things like that. So in the process of doing so, you're taking one form of nitrogen and turning it into another. So oddly enough, that actually helps fertilize the environment. If you ever thought about why fertilizer is, well, what it is, and we get it from animals in the ways that we do, it's because they're giving us the forms of nitrogen that can be used to help grow plants. But anyways, if you go back to the very bottom there, you'll see that the process looks pretty similar, except for it has the nitrous oxide step added in, but everything else is exactly the same. So the abridged version is nitrogen in the air turns into ammonium or ammonia. That is nitrified into nitrates. That is absorbed by plants. Plants are eaten by animals. Animals are eaten by animals. Animals die and decompose because of decomposers. And then there are bacteria that do the opposite process that turn it back into nitrogen gas, and you go all the way around. And that is the nitrogen cycle.